I'm Margery Ganz, and I spent 41 years teaching Italian Renaissance history at Spelman College in Atlanta. So what I've done for today is to try and fill in some holes from the Medici program. And also, so this is not organized. I left my notes for this stuff are in my cubby, and I didn't realize it till yesterday. And I couldn't get down there and dig them out. So I just put a sheet together that has some of the things about the Renaissance and that are about the program that we're now watching on Netflix. At least I think people are watching it either on Netflix or you can watch it on 1390 on Wednesdays at 7:30. And this week, 1390 played episode 1 of season 1 and then played episode 2. It just went right on to that. So I don't know what they're actually going to play this Wednesday. But part of the course.
Didn't it do 2 more?
That occurred to me, that it was part of the course. So, anyway, so the only thing I put on the board, which is also on the sheet, is the sense of history that the Renaissance had about itself and about what came before. So before the Renaissance, which is roughly 1300 to 1600, and in the north of Europe, it's mostly the Reformation rather than the Renaissance. But it has some of the same texts. Because the idea, in terms of literature, was to get what the literature looked like originally, to go back to the original sources. And that's why you had all these schools that taught Latin and Greek. And this was the curriculum. But it was a linear view of history, which is the top one, which at the year 0 for AD, when Christ is born, the argument is from then on, history is getting less good. I'm searching for words, I'm not used to this anymore. A year away has done it. So that they thought that the great ancient works were pagan. And so it was a religious view of history. Christianity was the dominant form of religion in Western Europe, and they saw it as a continuum. The Renaissance did not call itself the Renaissance, but it sensed that it was different, that it had gone back to a time when Italy was great. I mean, if you're a civilization that ends up not so great, not so good to its people or to its culture or anything like that, you don't want to take that as your model going forward. So they came up with a secular view of history, with the first golden age, so to speak, would be the people I put on the board. Plato, Aristotle, Plutarch, Cicero, in terms of the citizenship. And it also would have included Christ's birth and the church fathers, St. Augustine, St. Jerome, St. Origen, St. Clement, both Greek and Latin church fathers. And then he went through a period of 1,000 years of darkness. I once had a student who wrote on an exam that the Middle Ages were dark because they had no streetlights. It was very good. They also told me that Protestants weren't Christian because only Catholics were Christian from their sense. And I told them that for my class, this was before I taught at Spelman, Protestants were going to be considered Christian. The ministers the year I taught in Chattanooga did not like me. And then it switches again in 1300 and you get Dante, you get Petrarch, you get Giotto, you get Cimabue, you get all these artists who are doing both secular and religious paintings. And they look back to a time when, and if you remember, ancient art has lots of these nude bodies, better bone structure, and stuff like that than they do in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, you get stick people. You get, out of somebody's clothing, you get 2 skinny legs and a flat foot. You don't get hands that are articulated. You get halos that are like a plate, like a soup plate, sitting up behind your head. So there is, in terms of the art and the culture, you end up with both secular ideas and secular themes in art, like protecting your city, like using your art as a diplomatic tool, stuff like that. And that's part of what the Medici are very involved in, because they had the money of the bank. They could afford to patronize artists. You know, the little David, the nude kid in the courtyard of the Medici Palace, was one of the early nudes of the 15th century. And Donatello, and then later Michelangelo, who goes and dissects bodies to figure out how the muscles work, are into this naturalistic art, as opposed to the ones where you don't belong, and only saints, they're only pictures of saints, and God, and the Virgin Mary, and the dove as the Holy Spirit. So you have a different kind of an art. You have an art that is put to use for the city. So Florence builds not only the walls that are around the city, and you'll see them in coming issues of the Medici, and you can imagine how thick they are, because I would say to you that the wall was as thick as the width of this room. And they built houses against the walls. And sometimes they did not build a 4th wall of a room. They just had the wall that was the city wall be the 4th wall. And they had these amazing gates, some of which are still left. And when a city started, if you think about it as a circle or a target, like you would use for bows and arrows, but put flat out horizontally, if you think about that, it had rings around that center of the city. And all the rings are from places where there were originally walls. And the cities then expanded outward. And then when they got to the next set of walls and they wanted to go beyond it, they had to make a whole nother set. So keeping the walls up were really important, as we'll see when we look at the next episodes, because it shows the war in which Volterra is taken. That's in season 2. I watched too much of it this weekend, but it reminded me of things that I really liked. There are a bunch of themes in the Renaissance. One of them has to do with statecraft and diplomacy. And Cosimo, who appears in episode 1, and Piero, his son, and on the back of the page are all the Medici and who they married. At least for what they're going to show in the series. I've lost track.
Statecraft.
Yeah, I'm sorry, what?
Statecraft, you said.
Right, statecraft. So it's a big change in how you think about a state, how you think about diplomacy, how you think about who is guilty of what kind of crime. And we'll see that, I think it's the 3rd episode that includes some of that. And what happens to the people who get left behind when their husbands, brothers, and fathers are exiled. And that's what I work on. I work on the idea of citizenship and what happens to women when their men rebel and then lose. Because the women become hostage for their husbands' good behavior in exile.
Wow. So where did they exile them to?
They always exiled them to places where they had money. They wanted them out of the way, and so they couldn't be troublesome to Florence. And this is also Venice, and it's also Milan, it's Siena, it's all the Italian cities. Did not want to pay to house and feed prisoners. So
So the bank, the Medici housed them?
So what happened with Cosimo is that in 1433, he lost the confidence of the Signoria, and he was sent into exile. There was a big debate over it, and they ended up sending him into exile for a year. Exile was not permanent in this time period. You were sent into exile for a limited period of time, and the expectation was you would come home to Florence, because the only place you could be a citizen was where you were born, unless there was a special decree. So there were 5 main states in Renaissance Italy: the Duchy of Milan, the Republic of Venice, the Republic of Florence, the Papal States run by the Pope, and the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, or Naples and Sicily. They were actually run by the Normans, and then by the Spanish who conquered Naples. And what they did in the Renaissance was they did away with the medieval idea that there was a Res Publica Christiana, there was a Christian commonwealth that included all of the states of Europe. All right, because if they all listened to the Pope, they were saved through the Pope's role. Then when they went on diplomatic, it's the beginning of modern diplomacy too. When they went on missions, up until this time, they were not given immunity the way diplomats are today, because everyone belonged to the same Christian commonwealth. So if you committed a crime you were the ambassador from Florence and you committed a crime in Spain, you would be tried under Spanish law and punished there. Today, if a diplomat commits a crime in the United States, they get back home. They are no longer an admitted person, they're a persona non grata. And so they get to go home and have to face justice, if they do, in their own home countries. And so this is the beginning of that kind of diplomacy. And they used to send people to represent the state for specific missions. And you wrote back and you got instructions from your city, or your duke, or your king, or whatever. But they sent you to do something, but they expected the same kind of behavior no matter where you were from, because you were all Christians together in this religious joining of people. And that's what the early episodes of the series are about, some of the diplomacy that Cosimo and his father, who gets killed in the first scene, Giovanni de' Medici, who's the one who really made the Medici family wealthy. He started it, Cosimo continued it, Piero wrapped it up, and Piero's son Lorenzo, the Magnificent, figures out how to do it and how to make the diplomacy work for him. So there is an attempt at balance of power politics with the 5 states. If it's 4 against 1, the 1 is always going to lose. None of them are strong enough to stand by themselves. It has to be something like 2 to 3, rather than 1 to 4. And so very often Florence, which was a republic, allied itself with Venice, which was also a republic. Sometimes Lorenzo would make an alliance with Milan, which is not a republic. And that was kind of troubling at times to the governing bodies of Florence. So you end up with diplomacy that works. You end up with Italy being flooded with condottieri, which are the soldiers of fortune, who work for sometimes Florence, sometimes Venice. Other people can fight their wars. And those leaders of those armies often were very skilled and made great deals for themselves. They're going to show you some of that army stuff in the series as well. But it works. You begin to have individualism. One of the great themes of the Renaissance, if you think of, the first one is probably politics, and how to make politics work for the state. There was a sense of a developing identification with a specific state. I'm a Florentine, I'm a Venetian, I'm a Roman. And they are different, even still today they're different. Then you get, besides the state and the idea of fame, that the despots, the rulers in these states often wanted to have, you have people who are willing to rule ruthlessly and take lots of chances. So you have politics, you have this new sense, you have despots who want to be remembered, who want fame. And they therefore commission artists to paint pictures of them. Paint pictures of them in armor. Paint pictures of them in the type of art that was called Sacra Conversazione, which is sacred conversation, which showed Mary and Christ surrounded by saints. And sometimes the saints were stand-in for people who gave the painting. But all of a sudden, you now have a circle that includes the viewer as being worthy enough to be around the Virgin and the Christ child. And you have then also personal portraits of the donors and their spouses often, sometimes with their children. Sometimes on the ceiling of decorated palaces, like they have in Mantova, where Federico di Montefeltro, who becomes the condottiere for Florence, eventually ruled as the Duke. Another theme then of the Renaissance is also individualism. And that comes out of looking at the family in a different way. The family could be, and was in the Middle Ages and the early Renaissance, an extended family that there was all the men of the same name. They can see the lines how they were related. Okay? So what happens beginning in the 1300s, the late 1300s, is that the families begin to form in Florence nuclear families, and instead worry about the man, his wife, their kids, who lived next door to their brother, who had his wife, and they didn't, while they knew they were all related, they no longer thought as a block. Okay? And then Florence and other states would send only the person who committed the problematic act into exile, not all the brothers, not 30 Albizzi men, and he's the one who leads the conspiracy against Cosimo. So you begin to have a sense of who you are. And these same people then also give art. And they either give chapels, they give statues, they give paintings. They want to be remembered for what they did to found the family. And all through the series, you hear these characters, these people in it, talk about individuals. My first alliance is to my family. I am forever an Acciaiuoli, which is the people I wrote my dissertation on. I am forever, like Contessina de Bardi, a Bardi. I don't lose my identity when I get married. And marriage, of course, had nothing to do with love. As we'll see, as Cosimo and later Lorenzo do a lot of organized marriages in order to make the diplomacy work and the economics work. Because who would you trust the most in order to be in your business? Family. Absolutely family. And they didn't trust many other people.
So what happens to children of a marriage if I keep my family and you keep your family? How do you?
No, the woman becomes part of the new family until he dies.
And then what?
And then what? It depends on how old she is and how much money she has. What they do, the first thing a man's estate has to pay back is the woman's dowry. That's the first obligation of the estate. And when Florence did two things that were very innovative in terms of economies. First of all, they invented double entry bookkeeping. And it's the Medici Bank that is in the forefront of that, which is the kind of bookkeeping we have today. Second, they created the catasto, which is on the sheet. In 1427, this was the first graduated income tax in the world. Okay? And each head of household had to bring to the tax office of his district his portate, his tax return. Okay? And they had to list everything. They had to list who they were, who their ancestors were. They had to list where this piece of property was listed in a previous catasto, under whose name. They had to list all the borders of their property. So, and they had to list all their property, both ones that were making money and ones that weren't. It was way ahead of its time, yeah.
Wasn't there something about the number of windows that you had in your house in Italy, and that meant something about your taxes?
It depended, that was a luxury, to have windows.
And so you painted over your windows so they wouldn't be considered tax.
You also put, later on, you put shutters on them.
Right, okay.
And often the first floor of family homes were businesses, because it was more dangerous than the upper floors where the living quarters were. So you ended up saying, I live in this house, and your house was tax exempt. Your first house, or your main house, whatever, was tax exempt. So you would list, I live in a house for my habitation with the following borders: my Uncle Robert, my grandmother, my brother, and the street. Children get listed as well, because you get a deduction for every child, for every mouth. There's a section called bocche, for mouths. And they had everybody listed, which is how we know more about the population of Florence than any place else, because all these records survived back from 1427. They're in a big book, big books that are like the width of the table, and folio pages. They're just amazing. They no longer let you look at them at your desk. You have to read them on microfilm. God bless technology. I was lucky when I had to do all the work for mine. I could have it on my desk and work on it. But they listed the property. They listed the houses first, then they went on and listed the businesses, then they listed debts, then they listed people who owed them money, then they listed bonds to fund the debt, and then they got to the mouths, and they had to list everybody's name, who their wives were, what their they were daughters of whoever. They had to list their ages. They had to list the children, and then they did all this mathematical jazz with coming up with a 0.5% was what a catasto was. The key was, when Florence was in such problems with debt and inflation in the 1420s, they could call the catasto, and they could call for 10 of them at a time, or 20 of them. So they were putting that percent of the property would end up being reduced, their net wealth, every time they listed a catasto. They imposed a catasto. No, I'm not getting it.
No.
Okay.
Are they,
What the catasto became the census that was the basis for taxation.
okay,
Okay? we have to pay taxes once a year, right?
Right.
In April, ignore estimated tax, okay? But in April, we pay it once. In Florence or other cities, you could pay it, they could impose 15 catasti, and that meant that 7.5% of your net wealth was gonna be due in taxes,
Okay.
okay?
But you didn't know when that was going to happen?
The signoria that you see in the beginning of the program, and will continue on through all the episodes, the governing body of Florence, could impose them whenever they needed to.
So they can impose multiple times
Yes.
in 1 year?
Yes.
Okay.
And they can impose multiple catastrophe at once. So in January, they can impose 10. They need more money in June, so they impose 10 more.
Ouch.
Yes. So the richest man in Florence in 1427 was almost poor by the time you got to 1434, because he paid all this money. And they didn't do the tax form every year. So in 1427, you might have to pay 10 florins. That would reduce your
Your wealth.
And then the next year, they imposed the catasto again, but they didn't redo the properties, they didn't redo the forms, so you got taxed on the previous year's
On top of what you've already paid.
Exactly.
Minus 10%.
Yeah.
Got it.
Okay, so this actually was a fairer system of taxation than Florence had been before, where rich people got forced to make loans to the government, and they got very little back. So this was fairer, and it was spread widely across the population. Most people paid nothing. Middle class income was such that you wouldn't have enough expenses, probably, unless you borrowed a lot or you were owed a lot. They also put, the properties in the countryside that they owned were part of the city tax base. And you had to tell who farmed the land for you, the same four borders, and then you had to tell them how many barrels of wine, how many barrels of oil, how many containers of grain, how many pigs, how many chickens your estate produced. They got an incredible amount of information, but they didn't know what a wealth it would be eventually for people like me who wanted to find out what society was like. Because I could look at the population, the mouths, and say, oh, look at that, he's 50 and she's 20. And they had these children, and they were born on the following dates. And it came off that many of them women had a child a year.
Yeah.
You know, everybody here is over 15, right?
Yes,
Yeah,
I think
okay.
that's safe.
I think that's safe. By the time you were 15
We're married.
and you weren't married, you were an old maid.
Yeah.
It's like
They
the town my-
believe,
it's
but they
like
only
the
live to
town my wife grew up in, North Carolina.
Okay,
Finished high school, you weren't married, you were an old maid.
yep. Look, I saw on the New York Times earlier this week, there was a little, one of those side comments, and it said that the age at which puberty begins now is lower than ever. It's like 8 to 10, when before it would have been like 13. And we teach people, wait till you're an adult to have children. And the Renaissance teaches people, get a young girl now and get her pregnant. This is the best age for her to get pregnant, is when she's young. And girls often remarried. Their brothers usually force them into it, or their fathers, if they could. The person I worked on had married, and she refused to get married again. And she was able, because she was wealthy, she was related to Cosimo's wife, Contessina de' Bardi, she ended up fine. Her father left his 2 daughters, because he had no sons. His wife was pregnant when he died. He left his estate to his son to be born, hoping it would be a son, which actually it was. And So he inherited, even though his father was already dead, he had to take care of his sisters, he could claim them as a tax deduction. He did. He tried to, his mother remarried, and she was the daughter of the richest man in Florence. And she had a very big dowry, and she had children with her new husband. Okay, and they tried to take her as a deduction, the girls who were his stepsisters, and the tax officials wouldn't let him do it because they should have been put under somebody else's deductions. These two little boys, this fraternal household that had 4 kids in it, 2 women, 2 girls and 2 boys, had a 7-year-old boy as the head of it, along with his 5-year-old brother at the time of the catasto, and the 2 girls, who didn't count for ages, they weren't worried about that. So it was crazy, but they ended up living happily as a family, so to speak, and the kids had money. I mean, the guy I did my dissertation on, Donato Di Neri Acciaiuoli, his wife had the biggest dowry Florence had seen. And we know this because of these books of records. Her dowry was 5,000 plus florins. Okay, the normal dowry for a middle-class girl was 80.
Oh, wow.
I only wanted to know what was wrong with her. But we had these, you have these books, some of them have survived, of the dowries. When a person put a deposit in for his daughter, and when it would mature, what the rate of exchange was. All this stuff is available now for people to play with it on the computer and get all kinds of ideas about family life. So the older sister of the woman Donato married was, her dowry was 6,000.
Wow.
And so basically, the father's creditors paid into the dowry fund for these 2 girls, rather than pay the family back, direct to the family, because you could do that. But it also meant that when people conspired against the government, that their assets were more readily viewable between the catasto and the dowry funds. Yeah.
And the dowry funds were public.
Yeah, because you had to be able to prove to a spouse that you were negotiating for your daughter, and we'll see some of that later in the series. Ruthie?
I was wondering, is this the beginning, could they take your property like eminent domain, like is this the beginning of the government taking your property if they
Yeah.
didn't pay the taxes?
Yes.
That was the beginning of the eminent domain.
But you have to provide for the wife if the husband is sent into exile by the government.
Okay.
And they had a whole administrative thing set up that would do that. There was one that took care of orphans, and there was another one that took care of the wives, because they got a living allowance based on the size of their dowries.
Oh, wow.
So,
Jeez.
and they had to negotiate to get their men back. So they wrote letters, they did political presentations, they got their friends and relatives to work on getting them back. Because the Florentines were totally disenfranchised if they were sent into exile. Their property wasn't confiscated until they committed acts of treason, after they had already been tried, often in absentia, for the crime of the Pazzi conspiracy that tried to kill Lorenzo the Magnificent and Giuliano, his brother, in 1478, or the Acciaiuoli and the Neroni and the Soderini in 1466, when there was not a plot to kill Piero de Medici, Piero the Gouty, but just an attempt to widen the franchise. They voted by sortition. They had these cute little fabric leather bags, and in it were little pieces of paper this big that had the names of the people who were eligible to hold office in Florence. And multiple times a year, they pulled the names, the ticket, from the bags. The bags still exist. because I saw them and held them in my hand in the archives. So the Florentine government believed that everyone, every amateur, every citizen who was of a certain status should be willing to give up some time of their life, some time of their year in service to Florence. So you have a government, an executive, that is 150 large, okay? Because nobody had spent any real time in the office. The top office is the Standard Bearer of Justice, which is on the sheet. He serves for 2 months. That's it. The 8 priors, 2 from each quarter of the city. The city is in 4 quarters, and then 4 gonfalone or wards or districts in each quarter. So 2 from each quarter every 2 months. The 12 good men were 3 from each quarter, and that was for 4 months. And the standard bearers of company are sort of 3 months, but there were 1 from each quarter. No, 4.
It just reached out.
From each gonfalone. And then you had the councils, which included all these people in the executive. So there's no continuity.
How'd they get anything done?
Because they had an ongoing administration and bureaucrats that they hired. Some that they brought in from outside. Yeah, Craig?
How were they chosen?
They were their names were pulled out of these
Oh,
bags.
just pulled out of the bag?
Right, there was no campaigning.
Save money on that.
Boy, that's good.
They literally had scrutinies, and they looked at the names that were going into the bag. You had to be a certain age, you had to be from a family that did X, Y, and Z. You had to be a guild member. There were 12 guilds. And you had to be a certain age before your name could be put into the bag. The bags were kept in the main churches of each quarter, because each of these that are listed, Santa Croce, San Giovanni, Santa Maria Novella, and Santa Spirito, which is across the river, the whole of the across the river part of Florence, each had a church of that name. And so the bags were kept on the altar. And there they knew no one would get in to steal them and to put anything into the bags. What the Medici did that was so brilliant was they created a scrutiny that went before your name got in. Because your name could be pulled. I could pull Leslie's name to be Standard Bearer of Justice, and she could owe taxes. Okay? If she owed taxes, she couldn't serve. If her daughter's name was then pulled next, she couldn't serve if her mother had served. Though, of course, they didn't let women serve in any of them. But they did that so that no one family got all the offices. There were hundreds of offices, both for inside the city. I mean, they were the festival makers for the Feast of San Giovanni the Baptist. That's the patron saint of Florence. There were also people who checked the weights and measures. There were people who patrolled the streets at night. There were people who made sure there were not homosexuals. There were people who made sure that prostitutes were clean. They had an office for everything.
And all these people were males, is that
Of course.
correct?
And were they paid?
Yes. They believed, the government of the city paid them, because they believed that you should be paid for your service, but that everybody had in rotation to do it. And the priors and the Standard Bearer of Justice lived in the public palace, because then their relatives couldn't get at them and get them to do what the relatives wanted. They were very shrewd, the Florentines. But, so all that is in the background of the Medici. And the Medici used their bank, which is one of the biggest in Europe, in order to do things for Florence. You could, if I wanted to send, if I was the bookseller, Vespasiano da Vistici, and I wanted to send books to someone who had ordered a book, who had ordered Aristotle's Ethics, and he was in Rome, I would send it in the pouch to the Medici bank, and the Medici would deliver it for me, for a fee. And this is the 15th century we're talking about.
Oh, this is so how they earned all their money.
They earned their money a lot of ways.
The beginning of Amazon.
The beginning of
That's
Amazon.
probably one of the better ways.
Yes,
It's a
but
shipping cost, right?
they were not horrendously high rates of interest in the banks. I mean, they didn't have to support the structure banks have to support today. But the Medici Bank was particularly good about investing money in Florence. And they used the Medici as their eyes and ears in the political world of the 15th century Europe. Because they had banks outside of Florence. They had banks in Barcelona, they had a bank in Madrid, they had one in the Netherlands, they had one in Paris. And the Bardi lose their money when the King of England defaults on a loan banks were forced to make him. So there were real consequences of the bank getting screwed or getting lost. And also the stakes for the Pope were high. Because I think it's the third episode, they have a whole set of things on Eugenius IV, who's one of the popes at the end of the schism where you had a pope in Avignon, you had a pope in Rome, you had a pope in Germany. And Cosimo was helpful in getting that pope elected and put back into Rome when he was forced to leave it. So they do a whole lot of that kind of stuff, and they share things that they learn with the priors, with the executive. And in addition to this, they had the people who were not elected, but who were consulted. So Cosimo could be consulted. His son Piero could be consulted. Cosimo was a man of the people. He did not walk around saying, oh, I'm Cosimo de' Medici, I'm great, I'm the father of this country. He was quiet, and at the beginning of the scene, I think, there is where he takes the cloak off his son and throws it in the fire. And he says, we don't wear rich garments. Because he wants this sense, he understands that they're not ready for a dictator, but instead that they're ready for somebody who's more of them. Everybody went up to Cosimo as he walked around the streets of Florence and had an ask, a request. Can you get my son a job? Can you get, your fourth degree extended family, somebody a job? And he did a lot of that. And Piero, Piero, who was his son, who's known as Piero the Gouty, because he had gout. Yeah, I call him Piero the Stupid. Ignored that stuff that his father did, and paraded around, and instead of going to the Palazzo Repubblico, where the government was held, he forced them, because he had the gout and he didn't like to walk, he forced them to come to the Medici Palace down the street. And he didn't have the right, Cosimo would have said he didn't have the right demeanor. And he pissed people off, which is why the people I study who conspire against him had a shot at it, but they, in the end, were not successful. Yeah?
Do you feel that the depiction on television is fair with regard to the characterizations that they...
I think they're a little overdone.
And what about the relationship with the peasant girl? Is that based on
I
any
think that's
kind of
probably
fact?
true. I think that kind of thing was very likely to be true.
Okay.
But I think that there was a sense of class, and certain lines are not supposed to be crossed, but they did all the time. The nobles had their own idea. Rinaldo degli Albizzi, who's Cosimo's enemy, is very much a figure that's not well portrayed in history. I think he was probably a little less worse than he was portrayed, but he certainly was not a nice guy. And I think that Cosimo and then Lorenzo, who were the Medici ruled, when they came back in 1434 from being in exile, they ruled for 60 years. until they managed to get themselves in trouble when Lorenzo the Magnificent's son, Piero, who I call the stupid, lost Florence to the Medici. And then they come back at the time of Machiavelli in 1512. But this isn't gonna go that far. I think this is only gonna go up to the end of the 15th century. Yeah, Roger?
Yeah, how do you rule for 60 years that this mechanism looks like it generates big turnovers in the Florentine government? And I don't see an election year here, I see a random process of pulling these things out of
Right,
these
but that
bags.
they see that as an election.
Okay, that's called an election. Well, how do you get certain people to be elected for 60 years? That's highly improbable if you're picking them
But
out
they
of the
did.
bag.
I mean, that's the thing, is they did manage to do it.
You
The
said-
Medici maneuvered the forms
Oh, well.
of the government so that they kept the reins of power. There were always, of the 8 priors, there was always a couple who were pro-Medici. And if you only have, in order to pass a law, to pass a bill, they write this thing up, and it has to pass the executive branch with majorities in each of the things, in the 12 good men, the priors, the standard bearer of justice, the 16 standard bearers, and then if it passes that with a majority, then it goes to the councils of the people in the council of the commune. So if you get your guys into the bags, they're gonna get called. That's how Cosimo gets back.
And the people that go in the bag are a limited section of the population.
Yes, you have to be a certain age, you have to have a certain,
Yeah, you
position.
mentioned, which is a small, relatively small number. Of
yeah,
people.
I mean, but it still put thousands of Florentines in offices, either doing the festaiolo bit for St. John the Baptist, for the parades that they still have on St. John the Baptist Day, or whether it's, if it's not that, or whether it's in their territory, because they controlled all of Tuscany, Florence did, and it had Lucca, and it had Pisa, and it had lots of small cities. Other people ended up going to be Podesta of Volterra, they went with a retinue, and it said on the pages of the books with all the list of names who was this Podesta, and if there was anybody really important in their judges or their notaries, who all got sent as staff with them for 6 months in a town. And you could repeat more frequently. So, but what Florence had was it had an administrative, bureaucratic group that just worked for the government and did the instructions to ambassadors, did all kinds of things that
Civil
were.
servants, essentially.
And civil servants, and those people did not have the short terms.
Good.
They provided the continuity. And the Medici did really well until they got thrown out in 1494. They came back in about 1512, I think. And then got thrown out again later, but they became the Grand Dukes of Tuscany. So they lasted fairly long.
How did the hierarchy of the Catholic Church relate to all of this?
Okay, the Catholic Church had a problem with its identity. By the time you get to 1308, the popes have been kidnapped. I'm drawing a total blank on which pope it was.
That's okay, we don't know anyway.
But there is one pope who, the pope argues, the Catholic Church argues that the pope is infallible at this point. Today, it's only that he's infallible in terms of theology, but then it was everything. And people bought a cardinal's red hat for their kids when they could, even though those cardinals would then come to elect the next pope. And just as it is now against the rules for people to solicit votes, or for people to be bribed to vote for somebody to be pope, that's the way many times those things got handled at that point. But the church's reputation was really crappy by the time you hit 1308. And one of the Holy Roman Emperors simply comes in and takes Pope Boniface VIII and takes him to France. And so the popes are out of Rome for like 70 years.
In
And did it-
In Avignon.
Avignon?
Exactly. And then you have this kind of interregnum where you have one pope in Rome, one pope in Avignon, and one in Germany in the Holy Roman Empire. And they eventually collapse into themselves and they get back to one in Rome. But the church's reputation was so bad that Dante puts popes in hell in the Divine Comedy for all kinds of things they weren't supposed to do. For their sexual habits, for their taking bribes, and all kinds of things. Usually, to get your son to be a cardinal, you had to pay the first year's worth of revenue from that area to the church to get the job. And then you could collect after that to try and make up that deficit in your budget. So there were so many things that were wrong. People have, and Martin Luther says the same thing in 1517. He argues because the popes were, many of them didn't read Latin, many of them, you didn't have to be a priest to become a pope in this time period. Yeah, that comes a little later. They were behaving very badly. They had lots of parties, bacchanals, etc.
Children.
Yes, and the kids. And one of the popes who deals with the Medici is the Borgia Pope. So they just ended up not behaving, so they get sort of really rammed by Dante. And so a lot of the stuff that they might have wanted to do was not done. I mean, Machiavelli says the same thing about the popes, how evil they are, and how they don't respect the laws. So you end up, and the Pope has two weapons to try and keep the people in line. He has excommunication, where you're put outside the boundaries of the church and nobody can talk to you, nobody can do business with you, all debts to you are canceled. An interdict, where in interdict no sacraments of the seven sacraments can be given if a city or a state is under interdict. That's what brought Henry II to his knees with the Archbishop of Canterbury when he was assassinated at the church. And that puts immense pressure on the ruler because the people can't get their kids baptized. They can't get married. They can't get buried. And those things really matter in this time period. And so that puts pressure on the people who put pressure on the rulers to do what the Pope wants. The Pope sees himself as number one. He's everything. He makes bishops. He gives cardinals hats out. He runs the church. And there isn't any appeal for that. And so it's really interesting to watch when the times they put people under interdict. The Pope always wins if there's an interdict, because the people put pressure on their rulers.
Do I dare ask what happened to Jews and all this?
Oh, they weren't loved.
Just leave it at that.
I mean, think about what the Catholic Church message was at that point. You know, the Jews are the people who killed Christ.
Forget that Jesus was a Jew, but that's.
They do forget that.
Right.
And they were always marginalized. They were on the edges of society. They were allowed to do the jobs that Christians couldn't. If you lent money at interest, it's usury. And so they let Jews lend money.
Okay.
They let they wouldn't let them bear arms, so there was a tax for not bearing arms, just like there was in New York, in the colony of New York, or New Amsterdam, I should say, when first people came over here to the States, or what became the States. There were things you could not do if you were Jewish. So, they created their own problems. They created stuff, and they couldn't get the money back if they were forced to make loans to rulers. The best way not to pay your borrowing back was to get rid of them, throw them out, and they did that.
Right. Easiest way.
Anybody else have a question? Yep.
The brother, Cosimo's brother, I thought he would be like the ruler. He seemed the stronger person. Cosimo was kind of like artistic and, yeah.
And Cosimo's brother is Lorenzo. And he dies before Cosimo. I mean, Cosimo lives to be an old man, because he's born in around 1400, if I remember correctly, and he dies in 1464.
But it's like Giovanni kind of wanted Cosimo to pick up the reins as opposed to Lorenzo in the
Okay.
movie, you know, I don't know. It just, I kept thinking Lorenzo's old, seemed older, he seemed like he ought to be the heir apparent, you know, to the Medici.
Yes, but I think that Giovanni de' Medici thought Cosimo was the talented one.
Yeah.
And he could manage the bank. Because if they lost the money in the bank, the family would have no power and no influence. And Cosimo was willing to spend money for the city. I mean, eventually the Medici family created a fabulous chapel in San Lorenzo, the church, their local parish church. They did all kinds of things that they gave to the city. And great art, public art, secular art. They have a guild church in Florence where each of the guilds had to put a statue in a niche for the saint that was the patron of their guild. And the Medici paid for several of those. And they used the bank to get information that was helpful to Florence. So, I mean, people knew they could depend on the Medici for a lot of things, which is why Cosimo, who was always careful to be very low level, low public persona, that really helped the Medici. And then, of course, everybody loved Lorenzo. At least most of them did, we'll see as we go on. Did I see a hand over here? Anybody?
Thank you.
What did you do?
You get an A.